This podcast is being recorded on August 27th, 2020. The pandemic and the economic collapse continue to be relentless topics of concern and conversation. Today, Congress struggles to support millions of people who have lost their job, lost their income, and stand now to lose their home. We want to believe that this will end, that a cure will be found, a vaccine will be developed, the economy will survive and grow strong, and perhaps we will even come out of this with a renewed hope that racial injustice can be overcome. But it's hard. Some days there just isn't enough hope to go around. There is no good news, the numbers keep rising, the isolation becomes intolerable, the politicians become childish, petty, and disdainful of the suffering all around them. The silent, invisible enemy seems to be winning the war that we did not choose to fight. So how did those generations who preceded us do it? How did they make it through the 1918 pandemic, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, 9/11, the 1957 flu pandemic, the hurricanes, the floods, the fires, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the countless disasters, natural and man-made, that have come and gone? The economic collapse we now endure is often compared to the Great Depression. Today, let's consider books, fiction and nonfiction, that try to help us cope. Then, as now, ordinary people were caught up and often devastated by unanticipated, extraordinary events. Many of those ordinary people did not survive, but many more did survive and thrive, and these are some of their stories. A very special book available on Hoopla, Down and Out in the Great Depression, by Robert McIlvaine, captures the daily anguish of people during the 30s. It puts the reader in direct contact with Great Depression victims, evoking a feeling of what it was like to live through the disaster. Following Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration, both the number of letters received by the White House and the percentage of them coming from the poor were unprecedented. The average number of daily communications jumped to between 5,000 and 8,000, a trend that continued throughout the Roosevelt administration. The White House staff for answering such letters, most of which were directed to FDR, Eleanor, or Harry Hopkins, quickly grew from one person to 50. And those letters were saved, and the author sifted through some 15,000 of them and culled nearly 200 letters that best show the problems, thoughts, and emotions of ordinary people during this time. Mainly because of his radio talks, many Americans felt they knew the president personally and could confide in him. They viewed the Roosevelts as parent figures, offering solace, hope, and protection. Roosevelt himself valued the letters, perceiving them as a way to gauge public sentiment. By preserving the original spelling, syntax, grammar, and capitalization of the letters, McIlvaine conveys their full flavor. I wonder if 50 or 60 or 70 years from now, someone will collect and publish letters, or emails maybe, or text messages that were sent during the pandemic of 2020. I wonder how history will remember this terrible, terrible year. The book, Down and Out in the Great Depression, by Robert McIlvaine. The next book, Okie Boy, The Great Depression in World War II, by Gene Ralston, is also available on Hoopla. Much has been written about Oklahoma farmers who lost everything in the Dust Bowl years and were forced to move west. But the fact is, not everyone who lived on an Oklahoma farm during that time abandoned their farm and headed for California. Many suffered crop failures and financial ruin, but there were just as many or more who were somehow able to make it through. The Dust Bowl, coupled with the Great Depression, which struck America at the same time, resulted in hardship and suffering, both for the farmers who went looking for a new life and for those who were able to stick it out. This book is a story about a family who stuck it out. Gene Ralston tells the story of the lives of a family of 7 who lived in a 2-room house, scratching out their lives on a dry land farm, running a few cattle and several hundred white leghorn chickens. Without running water, electricity, or a telephone, the family existed on a survival ladder, gradually growing out of it as their fortunes improved. Having survived the Dust Bowl, the family was dumped into the rationing and shortages we all experienced during World War II. This book is about people, real live people, who through no fault of their own had to cope with 3 of the most devastating tragedies in American history: the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and World War II. Today, we are dealing with a pandemic, an economic collapse, and a resurgence of racial conflict. The parallels are striking. The book is Okie Boy, The Great Depression and World War II by Gene Ralston. And believe it or not every book about the Great Depression is filled with heartbreak and sadness. Our third book is How I Lived and Laughed Through the Great Depression and Thereafter by Nicholas Petrovich. This is a short book, only 94 pages, and it is available on Hoopla. The author, Nicholas Petrovich, was 84 years old when he wrote the book in 2011. He tells stories of growing up in Chicago during the Great Depression. His stories are entertaining as well as enlightening because they provide insight into some of life's important lessons by giving us a glimpse of how life was then, without TV, the internet, iPads, and all the trappings we so take for granted. Petrovich is a skillful storyteller who transports the reader back through time and space to relive his experiences, his memories, and the lessons he learned, some exciting, some sad, but often humorous. In this, his first published work, he takes the reader to a time today's generation has never known. Turning now to fiction, you may remember an earlier podcast where I talked at some length about The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. It is revered in high school and college English classes, and it led Steinbeck to the Nobel Prize in Literature, but was it all his own original story? Sonora Babb was born in Oklahoma Territory in 1907, and in 1939 her book, Whose Names Are Unknown, a novel, was slated for publication by Random House. But when Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath swept the nation, Random House shelved the book and said that Steinbeck's novel had adequately explored the subject and another book would be superfluous. Babb's lyrical novel about a farm family's relentless struggle to survive in both Depression-era Oklahoma and in the California migrant labor camps gathered dust for decades. It was rescued from obscurity by the University of Oklahoma Press and finally published in 2004. It is the story of the members of the poor but proud Dunn family and their circle of equally determined friends, and it provides another legitimate glimpse into life on the dust-plagued prairies of the Southwest and in the fertile but bitterly disappointing orchards and vineyards of the so-called Promised Land of California. Immediately upon publication, scholars noted strong parallels to Steinbeck's classic novel. Writing in the Steinbeck Review, Michael Meyer noted numerous, quote, obvious similarities, close quote, between the two novels, quote, that even a cursory reading will reveal, such as Babb's account of two stillborn babies mirrored in Steinbeck's description of Rosa Scharn's baby. Among other scenes and themes repeated in both works, the villainy of banks, corporations, and company stores that charge exorbitant prices, the rejection of religion and the embrace of music as a means of preserving hope, descriptions of the fecundity of nature and agriculture, and the contrast with the impoverishment of the migrants, and the disparity between those willing to extend assistance to the migrants and others who view Okies as subhuman. Meyer, a Steinbeck bibliographer, stops short of labeling these parallels as outright plagiarism, but concludes that Steinbeck scholars would do well to read Bab, if only to see for themselves the echoes of grapes that abound in her prose. Steinbeck did know Bab, and he may well have had access to the notes she was making as he researched the book. It is unlikely we will ever know if Steinbeck stole his story from Bab, but the good news is that if you loved The Grapes of Wrath, and I did, and you were sorry when you reached the last page, and I was, there actually is another beautifully written story interweaving the same themes. It is not available on Hoopla, but you can request it through Interlibrary Loan. Finally, let's consider Chicago author Nelson Algren's first novel, Somebody in Boots. The story is based on Algren's personal experiences of living in Texas during the Great Depression. The title refers to someone with material well-being and authority, as poor folk and the powerless wore shoes or went barefoot. The bosses and police, feared by the poor and downtrodden, wore boots, which not only symbolize their power and relative affluence, but can be used as weapons against them. The material in this book was reworked into a more familiar title, A Walk on the Wild Side, published in 1956. Algren was not satisfied with the first novel and said it was an uneven novel written by an uneven man in the most uneven of American times. The reading public apparently agreed, as only 750 copies of the book were sold. Nonetheless, it is an interesting read, and Algren buffs will enjoy reading it and then reading Walk on the Wild Side to see how the author made the book better. It is available on Hoopla. In the years to come, many books will be written about the 2020 pandemic, just as many books have been written about all the crises the world has faced. Right now, though, when hope runs out and the world seems dark, try Googling this phrase, poetry of the pandemic. The phrase again, poetry of the pandemic. You will find that poets around the world are using words to battle the fear, the loneliness, the hopelessness, the anger, the frustration we all feel most every day. Spend some time reading the poems you find. Words matter, and sometimes the poets can find the words we cannot. Stay safe. Thanks for listening.